Jews wrote Adam as an ancestor, the man made of clay. Adam and Eve disobeyed God. They ate the forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden. In his anger, God sent rain to purify the land. God chose Noah to build Noah's Ark. He took the seeds of the plants and the ancestors of the animals on board Noah's Ark, except for the life on Noah's Ark. Until God's cleansing program was complete, Noah's descendants restored their relationship with God. God chose Abraham. He promised him that he would be the father of all nations, and a promised land was given to him. Abraham proved his devotion to God by tying his son Isaac to the altar. Despite his son's pleas, Abraham raised the dagger. He stood up for his faith. At the critical moment, God stopped him. God sent a lamb as a sacrifice. Isaac's life was saved, and Isaac's son, Jacob, was later given a new name by God, Israel, and their descendants would be called Israelites. 400 years later, there was a great famine in Israel. The Israelites abandoned and fled God's promised land to Egypt and became slaves of the Egyptian pharaohs. The so-called God, the so-called Abraham, had become a legend that the Israelites would not speak of until the appearance of Moses, the prince of Israel, who could talk to God. He would lead his people out of Egypt, but the enslaved Israelites didn't want to talk to him, and so did Pharaoh, who was too high and mighty to care. So Moses performed the 10 plagues of Egypt. A wooden stick plunged into the Nile and instantly stained the water. Pharaoh, who was bathing, was horrified, but the bloodshed was only one of the 10 plagues. There were 9 other plagues against Pharaoh.
Let my people go. No! No! No!
Until the 9 plagues had passed, Pharaoh still wouldn't let the Israelites go. Then came the 10th plague, the worst of all. A plague took Pharaoh's firstborn son, but the Israelites were all in one piece. Pharaoh was furious and told them to get lost.
Land, take your wretched God with you!
The Israelites jumped for joy and followed Moses back to the promised land that God had promised them. But then Pharaoh looks at his son and suddenly backtracks. He wants to bring the Israelites back to be buried with him. At that moment, Moses led the Israelites to the Red Sea. In front of them, the Red Sea blocked their way, and Pharaoh's army was attacking from behind. The Israelites began to blame Moses. Look what you've done. You don't think we have a place to die in Egypt? Take us to the Red Sea to die. Moses walked calmly towards the sea. He unleashed a great move, splitting the Red Sea with a staff. The Israelites rushed to follow Moses through the Red Sea. Pharaoh ordered his cavalry to continue the pursuit. The Israelites soon passed through the Red Sea, but the Egyptian soldiers in the sea were still chasing. Suddenly, the waters of the Red Sea began to close, and the passage closed naturally. The waters of the Red Sea instantly flooded all the soldiers. This scene helped the Israelites escape the Pharaoh's pursuit. Moses led the Israelites to the border of the Promised Land. God gives Moses a code of laws carved in stone. The codex reaffirms God's promise to Abraham. The Israelites had a new code to take the Promised Land. 40 years later, Joshua, with the help of God's messenger, the Israelites easily defeated the Rephilim and captured the city of Jericho. 100 years later, Saul, the first king of Israel, was crowned. David, the second king, captured Jerusalem and built the capital. Solomon, the third king, built the temple of God. After the nth generation, kings began to live in luxury. The ancient Babylonian kingdom took advantage of the situation and captured Jerusalem. This is the end of the Israelite monarchy. Once again, the Jews were forced to leave their homes. They traveled 1,600 miles east to Babylon, where they would live in inferiority and subjugation. Soon the king of Persia invaded Babylon. The king of Persia kindly pardoned the Israelites. The Israelites began their journey home. They returned to the Promised Land with hope and faith. 500 years later, the Romans took Israel. The Jews were once again plunged into darkness. It was against this backdrop that Jesus was born. He would lead the Jews out of their troubles. But little did he know, Jesus' ministry affected the interests of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the upper class of Jews. The Pharisees bribed Judas to murder Jesus. And that's how the Last Supper came to be known. Why did the Jews hate Jesus so much? They wanted to crucify him alive. The piercing pain was too much for Jesus to bear. Then they put the nail in the palm of Jesus' right hand. The pain was so intense that Jesus cried out. Then the nail was placed in the palm of Jesus' left hand. The sound of the hammer was so intense that Jesus nearly fainted from the pain. But Jesus endured the pain and clenched his teeth. He insisted on suffering for the world until the soldiers put up the cross. Until the last moment of Jesus' life, Jesus had the only question of his life.
God, why have you forsaken me?
I don't know if God is too far away, but you must know that the Jews are too close. When Jesus healed the leper, when Jesus overturned the coins in the temple, when Jesus was worshipped by all of this touched the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the upper class Jews. They controlled everything. They were in control. They easily bought Judas for 30 gold coins. Of course, Jesus knew all this, so at the Last Supper, Jesus tore the loaf of bread in half and shared it with the disciples on behalf of his body. Then he poured wine into the cups and let each disciple taste it to signify that I am with you. Then Jesus said something that surprised everyone. One of you, out of the 12, will betray me? The disciples were instantly surprised. Peter rushed to ask who it was. Jesus didn't answer. He tore off a piece of bread and asked Judas to eat it. Judas said he would not betray Jesus, but Jesus put the loaf right into his mouth. He told Judas to do what he had to do. Judas got up quickly and left, carefully spitting out the loaf of bread that Jesus had fed him. Late at night, the Garden of Gethsemane was very dull. Judas took the guards of the Jewish priests with him. He betrayed Jesus with a kiss. The disciples fought to save Jesus. In the confusion, they stabbed the guard in the ear. Jesus was still unruffled. He healed the guard by touching his ear. But the Jews didn't thank Jesus. They took him back to the temple to be beaten and interrogated. The Jewish priests tried to get Jesus to confess. Are you the Son of God? To the horror of all the Jewish priests present. In a panic, they tear off their clothes to relieve their emotions. In a democratic show of hands, Jesus' guilt or innocence is decided. All the Jewish priests raise their hands in the affirmative. The next day, Jesus was brought to the governor's palace to be convicted. The governor didn't want to offend either side, so he arranges for Jesus to receive 40 lashes. The 40 lashes almost killed Jesus, but Jesus, with all his flesh and all his pain, still not enough to satisfy the Jews. So the governor gave the Jews a choice. They would release Barrabas, the murderer, or Jesus, the preacher. To the governor's surprise, the Jews chanted, "Free Barrabas." He was the only man who ever defeated Jesus. Barrabas, the murderer. The governor gave the fanatical Jews a choice to release Jesus, the innocent preacher, or Barrabas, the murderer. The Jewish high priest rushed to the crowd. He's not the king of the Jews. Then he kissed the governor's ass. Our only king is Caesar. The Roman governor still gave them a choice. The Jewish priests exchanged glances. From the crowd, they shouted, "Free Barrabas." Then more shouted, "Free Barrabas." Then they raised their hands in the air, and together they demanded the release of Barrabas. The Roman governor couldn't believe it.
You choose a murderer?
Barrabas raised his hands in excitement with a triumphant look. Jesus, on the other hand, was not displeased. Jesus did not take offense to Barrabas' release. The Roman governor continues to ask Jesus what to do. The Jewish priests are up to their old tricks. "He's not our king. Crucify him." That's what they say. The Jews immediately followed suit. They shouted for Jesus to be crucified. This display of fervor had the Roman governor in stitches.
Condemn this man and spare a murderer.
But the Jews wouldn't listen. They continued with their fervor. The governor couldn't stand the pressure and ordered Jesus to be crucified. He looked down with disdain at the frenzied Jews on the stage, and the Jews' utter madness had just begun. Jesus carries the cross on the path of suffering, soldiers at his back, flogging him, and the Jews on either side of him kept yelling. Jesus finally saw the world for what it was. Once they welcomed him in the streets. Once they were followers. Now there's nothing but insults and taunts. Now they look on in disbelief. Jesus stumbles and falls on the ground where he once preached. The Virgin Mary rushed to him, but Jesus reassured his mother not to be afraid. Mother and son together lifted the cross, but Jesus had to carry it alone. He was wood the whole way when Jesus couldn't stand it anymore and fell to the ground. The Jews, who were watching, shouted, "Coward." A woman tries to give Jesus some water, but she's kicked away. Jesus could only get up and continue to carry his cross. And so Jesus walked out of Jerusalem, and that's how he got to the place of the skull. The soldiers tore off Jesus' robe and drove him to the cross. The soldiers first fastened his right hand with a nail. Then his left hand was fastened with a nail. Next, they crossed his feet and nailed them firmly to the cross. Then all the soldiers worked together to erect the cross. Jesus was at the end of his life, but he still begged God to forgive the Jews.
Forgive them, for they know not what they do. My God, why have you forsaken me?
God may have heard Jesus' call. At that moment, the sky and the earth changed and thunder rolled. The candles in the temple flickered. The canvas tore. The earth began to tremble, and the Jews began to tremble, and all the people were in a state of confusion. It was God taking Jesus' soul. Then the soldiers thrust the spear of destiny into Jesus' body. To make sure that Jesus was not breathing at all, the believers put Jesus in a cave and sealed the entrance with a huge stone. 3 days later, the cave was somehow opened. Jesus was resurrected in the flesh and lived with his disciples for 40 days. Then he ascended to heaven on the Mount of Olives.